No expense spared. Joe Biden welcoming India's Prime Minister for a state visit. The halls decked for Narendra Modi's first White House banquet. Just one illustration of how much clout carries a diaspora, 4.5 million in the United States, and how strategic India's become in superpower showdowns these days. On the visit, the announcement of plans to transfer warplane engine technology to Delhi offers quite the contrast from the days when India turned to Russia for weapons and the U.S. only armed Pakistan. It's not just the U.S., France at the heart of both mega military and civilian plane deals these days, and will make Modi its guest of honor at its annual Bastille Day military parade, July 14th. How high are the stakes in these showdowns between the West, Russia, and China, which shares a long border with India? The high praise for Modi has the Macrons and Bidens of this world glossing over, say critics, evidence of democratic backsliding in the world's largest democracy. Ahead of next year's elections in India, how much should the West look the other way? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Modi's state visit to Washington. And with us from the U.S. Capitol, Irfan Nuruddin, director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. Thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Journalist Suketu Mehta is the author of This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto. Thanks for joining us here. Welcome to Paris.
Thanks very much. Great being here.
Great to see as well commentator and business consultant Pradeep Singh. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Leila Jacinto, senior editor, France24.com. How are you?
Good to be here.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, earlier there was a full house on the south lawn of the White House. There was the U.S. president. There was his vice president, whose mother is Indian-born, Narendra Modi, who in his remarks gave a nod to closening trade and defense ties between superpowers.
In this time period, the friendship between the US and India will be instrumental in enhancing the strength of the whole world.
और समृद्धि के लिए दोनों देश साथ मिलकर काम करने के लिए प्रतिबद्ध है.
The two countries are committed to working together for the global good and for global peace, stability, and prosperity.
And highlighting just how much those ties are closening is a memorandum of understanding between General Electric Aerospace and its state-owned Indian counterpart to make fighter jet engines for the Indian Air Force. Modi, earlier in the day, meeting GE boss Lawrence Culp on the sidelines of that history-making deal. The agreement includes the potential joint production of GE Aerospace's F414 engines in India, this to power Tejas fighter jets for the Pentagon to approve the transfer of military technology to a non-NATO ally is described by many, Irfan Nuruddin, as a first.
It is a first, and it marks a completely new stage in the U.S.-India relationship. This is something that would have been quite unimaginable in many ways 25 years ago. Maybe, this is really a testament to how far the multiple administrations in the United States and multiple governments in India have worked, because I think the writing's been on the wall that the future of the 21st century relies on these two countries figuring out if they can work together closely. Otherwise, both of them think that they're at a disadvantage vis-a-vis China.
And this is sensitive technology. It's not something you can sort of decide on a whim.
A lot of negotiations behind the scenes. I think the one thing that has been underestimated is that the biggest driver of this relationship over the last 20 years has really been the defense side of it. And it accelerated in the last 10 years under Prime Minister Modi. There were some pretty landmark memoranda of understanding at the logistics level put in place at the end of the Obama administration. Mr. Trump did not necessarily move it forward, but he did not undermine that either. The bureaucracies continue to talk to each other and work with each other. And the Biden administration has essentially placed a really big bet that India can be the defense partner in the region that it has desperately been seeking. This actually works well for India as well because it upgrades India's military technology considerably. And more importantly, maybe in the short term, it provides manufacturing jobs, which are critical for India's economy.
You heard it there, Irfan Nuruddin, Leela Jacinto, describing this as a bet. Is it a bet?
Well, what appears to have been the case is both the U.S. and India appears to have learned lessons from this. India, of course, has not condemned Russian aggression in Ukraine. So the Biden administration is keen to get India on camp. Now, if you ask Indian diplomats and experts, why does India still cleave to Russia? They typically say that India, when it makes these defense deals, wants a technology transfer and wants manufacturing in India. And the U.S. typically has offered off-the-shelf arms sales. So it appears that Washington has got that lesson, that there is a technology transfer and manufacturing with this deal. On the other hand, this deal involves Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, which is a state-owned company, and not like what we saw with the French Rafales, which had some of these business leaders with close ties to New Delhi, Ambanis, Adanis. They don't have any, say. They don't really have the expertise of building this. So on both sides, lessons have been learned. But with the Tejas fighter jets, these are very long projects. The Tejas, the rollout was supposed to be early November, then 2022, then it moved to 2023, and now it's 2024. And, they're having problems getting funding for it. So these are very long-term projects, but it's definitely showing a shift in that alliance.
Pradeep Singh, traditionally, India bought its armament from Russia.
That's right.
Now, its second largest provider is France, with most notably the fighter jet deal, that first one that Leela Jacinto mentioned. They're hoping for a second big one around the time of that Bastille Day visit.
Right.
Enter the United States. Is it a problem if the U.S. is still procuring arms to Pakistan?
Well, not really. Not really. First of all, let's look back at the background of how things were with the Russian equation. You see, for decades on, India was procuring from Russia also because the high-tech items from the West were not available to India. They were going to Pakistan, for example, or some other countries, but also because the high-tech technology was not on offer, let alone transfer of technology. So for decades, this thing was denied to India, and this is what kept on consolidating the equation with Russia.
Can you still say today that India is this non-aligned country when you see that it's in the Quad now, that group that's in the Indo-Pacific, and clearly with an aim to containing China? Is it still a non-aligned nation with this deal in particular?
Well, to begin with, I think the whole concept of non-alignment actually has gone out of the window, if not become jaded altogether. Because now more and more countries are looking at their core interests in every single sector. So India as well is now driven by its own core interests, and that is why they are taking care of so many other issues to keep the country progressing. But the concept of non-alignment, it doesn't exist anymore. The whole movement of non-alignment is actually gone out of the window.
So both the United States and France courting India for closer defense ties and defense deals. Earlier, again, on the South Lawn, it was also Joe Biden who spoke. A lot of the diaspora in the United States is pro-Modi, but not all. And he gave passing nod to concerns over religious freedoms and human rights.
Equity under the law, freedom of expression, religious pluralism, and diversity of our people. These core principles have endured and evolved even as they have faced challenges throughout each of our nation's histories, and will fuel our strength, depth, and future.
So, Suketu Mehta, the language chosen there by Joe Biden versus that memorandum of understanding on fighter jet engines, what's the message Washington is sending to Delhi?
Well, the message that's being sent with all these deals is that the US-India relationship isn't based on a mutual interest in democracy and the protection of human rights and freedom of expression. It's a transactional relationship based on selling things. And it's deeply alarming. Indian democracy has never been under greater threat. And I know that there are people in the Biden administration, including Biden himself, because I've spoken with them, who are feeling enormous concern about what's happening in India right now. But they can't express it openly because they need India's support to combat the rise of China. And they're hoping that India will come around to the American viewpoint vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Leela Jacinto.
I agree entirely with what Suketu says, and when it comes to this U.S.-India foreign policy, the elephant in the room is China, of course. But on that, the calculation may not work in Washington D.C.'s favor because India will conduct its foreign policy according to its own strategic interest. And India and China share a 2,600-kilometer border. The U.S. has already, gone out of Afghanistan, which means the U.S. has to maintain its ties with the Pakistani army. So the fact that somehow India is going to abandon its position on China and jump onto the West camp is sort of not understanding how Delhi operates.
Irfan Nuruddin, back in 2020, India's external affairs minister described the West as frenemies and talked about transactional relations. Is it still that transactional, or have things changed since 2020?
I would agree with Mr. Mehta. It's still transactional, but what we've done a much better job of is put it under the veneer of being a deep, enduring strategic partnership that could emerge. I don't want to be cynical. It could be that over the next 20 years, we begin to see a genuinely strategic partnership between the West and India. But in the short run, India still views the West with, I think, more suspicion than we realize. I agree with Mr. Kumar that non-alignment is gone. The External Affairs Minister prefers to refer to it now as multi-alignment, as strategic autonomy. And I think what the West has to understand is that, it's not obvious what India will do if push comes to shove where China is concerned. If anything, the lessons from Ukraine suggest that India is not going to do a whole lot at all. And so I think the only way to interpret this is that a very, very slow burn, a very slow cultivation, a removal of a lot of bureaucratic hurdles that have long existed in doing even some pretty basic things. And with due respect, you referred to Mr. Biden's remarks as a passing nod. I think you got to really contort that to see this as anything other than actually a defense of Mr. Modi's record at this moment, right? This is going to get played on news stations across India, not as being a veiled criticism, but in fact an endorsement of the strength of India's democracy, of its record on religious freedom, etc. So Mr. Biden might have been trying to pass words, but I'm afraid that the message will not have landed if that was his intention.
And will also be covered a lot is, of course, the pomp and circumstance of a state visit
Exactly.
at the last White House state dinner for France's president Emmanuel Macron. It was lobster, caviar, and beef. This time there's sea bass upon request, but of course the chefs concocted a menu fit for a guest of honor who's a vegetarian.
Did a wonderful marinated millet salad, highlighted with a Maryland silver corn. We're in Maryland as well, and also some wonderful compressed watermelon that's local.
The portobello mushroom has been roasted to perfection, and then it's just a very flavorful and satisfying meal, along with the roasted baby carrots that are sitting on a yogurt lemon dill sauce. And included with this today, we have a modern twist on an American classic with cardamom infused strawberries. We have a rose syrup marinade with that.
Lila Jacinto, your culinary thoughts.
Well, there was no beef burger on the menu, that's for sure. I think probably what should have been on the menu is Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. But just to go back to what we were talking about, transactional politics, let's examine the stakes of this. I completely agree with Irfan. You know, this is going to be played very differently in India. The stakes of this is, you know, Biden makes these statements after tremendous pushback. You know, you have three congresswomen who are going to, you know, they're not going to be present at his speech in Congress. You have the Indian diaspora, the people who are alarmed about the liberal the backsliding, you know, mobilizing like never before. The stakes of this is, you know, Biden's in some constituencies, certainly in the Muslim world and certainly in the global South, is that Biden's foreign policy is as transactional as Trump's foreign policy. He fist bumped MBS from Saudi Arabia. He's now wooing Narendra Modi with a state visit. In the end, the global South, when it comes to the Ukraine war, does not side with the West because it just sees the hypocrisy of the West. On the one hand, you know, democratic values are talked about but never acted upon. And so, you know, when there is a Ukraine war and then the global North is extremely surprised, you know, that we have not managed to convince anyone. But realpolitik always trumps values and human rights and democratic backsliding, which is now it's actually an electoral autocracy.
Yeah, an electoral autocracy.
That's not me. That's experts who have said that.
Right. Pradeep Singh. What's your reaction to the language you heard from Joe Biden there?
Well, to begin with, first of all, India is a democracy, US is a democracy, and on both sides you will have people with differing views. So that has to be granted, okay? That's part of the par for course, as far as I'm concerned. But at the same time, when people talk about democracy backsliding in India, let us look at some of the most recent electoral results in the country. You have had the latest election in one of the biggest states in South, where BJP was ruling, it was decimated, okay? Before that, two other states where BJP was ruling, they lost the elections. So had democracy been sliding or had it been electoral autocracy, as some experts are saying, then all these results would have not gone against BJP. That is number one. Okay, then when it comes to the press freedom, for example, because that is intrinsic part of the democracy, of course, when you look at the latest rankings that have come out, would you believe that India is ranked at 161 in the world in press ranking? Afghanistan is ranked at 152. So that actually gives you a lot of doubt about how these press rankings are also worked out.
Suketa Mehta, you're a journalist.
I absolutely am. And with all due respect, the people who compile these rankings, they aren't just making these numbers up. India has slid enormously in press rankings. There's basically no independent television networks left that do not toe the government line. So it's not as if there are government censors which go and censor pieces of news. And yes, there are elections, but the government's been incredibly effective in using the taxation authorities, the enforcement directorate, and the manipulation of financial oligarchs to control the press. So it's not so much a Soviet model as it is a Polish or Hungarian model. The press in India, and I've been working as a journalist in India and America for many decades now, has never been in greater peril. And this is an orchestrated campaign by the party that's ruling the country. So this is Reporters Without Borders. There's a number of internationally recognized organizations that have given these these really lamentable rankings to India for press freedom. It's not just the press. The greatest peril is Indian Muslims. There's over 200 million Indian Muslims. And they're systematically being told by the government, this is not your country. This is a Hindu country. This is what the stakes are. We've got to be clear what the stakes are. The BJP and the RSS, which is this non-political paramilitary organization organized along fascist lines that created the BJP, they are clear about their intentions to turn India into a Hindu nationalist state where everyone else lives by Hindu sufferance, including 200 million Indians. What do you think that's going to do? If 200 million Indians are alienated, you'll have a civil war which will make partition seem like a schoolyard brawl.
Okay, can I? Fine. Now, you see, this anti-Muslim thing has been also, debate has been going on also for some time. But let me just put on the table a few facts, okay? In 1947, when India became independent, the Muslims were about 10% of the population. That make them about 30 million. Today, Indians are 15% of the population, and they have crossed 200 million people. So there has never been anything like a genocide or a mass murdering or so on and so forth.
But there's been criticism leveled at the citizenship bill, most notably singling out religious minorities, in particular Muslims.
Not really, Francois, because that bill was for a specific purpose to allow the minorities of the neighboring countries that were being persecuted so they could come to India. But it was not meant for the Muslim citizens of those countries who, in any case, carved out a country for themselves. So after 70 years...
Indian Muslims are also Indian citizens.
No, that bill was not against Indian Muslims.
Right.
Let's be very clear.
But there were many citizens in the border states who had to prove that they were citizens.
I'm just talking about the bill per se. Fine. The bill per se was never against any Indian citizen, and the word is any Indian citizen, whether a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever. Indians were not concerned. It was only the minorities in those countries that were concerned. But let me take a minute. I would like to refer to the Pew Research results that came recently, a couple of years back. They interviewed 30,000 families in India, all adults across the country. And, they came out with some startling results. They have found out 90% of Muslims and Christians in India say they are free to practice their religion. 90%. 95% of Muslims and Christians say they are proud to be Indian. And 85% of Muslims in India are saying, India is not perfect, but Indian culture is better. India is a great place to live. These are facts. Okay, I'm not going by perceptions. I'm just stating facts as they have been reported.
Irfan Nuruddin, very briefly, because I think we're going to be interrupted soon by the leaders of the United States and India from the White House. On the whole citizenship law, how much is that going to be coming up in conversation during this state visit?
I don't think at all. I mean, this is a transactional relationship dressed up to be about other things, but I think Mr. Biden has been steadfast in resisting calls to even comment on India's human rights record and democracy. The goal over here is to make sure that every part of this is well scripted and on a single message, which is that the United States and India are going to work with each other in many different dimensions, from technology to trade to defense. China won't come up explicitly, but China is the matchmaker that has arranged this marriage, if you would, and both sides are going to play to their script. And so to expect anything else, I think, would be naive. And frankly, at the end of the day, this is a state visit. This is not the time for that. The die was cast when the invitation for the state visit was made. It was a decision made at the highest level of the American government and implemented by every part of the bureaucracy, that we're not going to talk about the awkward stuff. We're not going to talk about the difficult stuff. And I would argue, frankly, because America doesn't really care about any of that stuff genuinely. The real concern that animates Washington, D.C. is one thing only, which is how to preserve American hegemony for as long as possible. France arguably understands that as well. And so we get to see Mr. Modi feted today and tomorrow over here, and on Bastille Day in Paris. And then in September, we'll host the G20, and then there'll be a Quad summit. This is India's moment, partly because it is China's moment in the world, and we all recognize that. And I think we're just getting a pretty tough lesson in just how dominant realpolitik logic works and how superficial many powerful states' commitments to more liberal values is. That, I guess, is the real world.
Of course, there is one thing that's evolved, and that is the clout of India's diaspora. It's personified by Vice President Kamala Harris, like we said. Her mother is Indian-born. More recently, by the new president of the World Bank, former MasterCard CEO Ajay Banga, seen here at the Global Climate Finance Summit taking place this Thursday in Paris. Irfan Nuruddin, you're right. It's not Narendra Modi that's invited to Washington. It's the Prime Minister representing India. And as such, just how much are politicians fawning again to cater to those 4.5 million who vote in the U.S.?
I think very much, but more than just as voters. I mean, Indian Americans are, at the end of the day, Americans. They're American citizens. India does not allow dual citizenship. And so the American citizens voting over here, they have diverse interests. They are overwhelmingly democratic according to survey data, but it's much more complicated than that. In fact, an insurgent GOP hopeful is Vivek Ramaswamy, an Indian American who's trying to be the next Republican nominee for president, for instance. So it's a diverse community. But I think the diaspora plays a slightly different role, which is that it's a diaspora that's very committed to its relationships with India and brings, therefore, a level of expertise and nuance to these conversations. So in every bureaucracy in America, and now increasingly in elected positions as well, at all levels, there are Indian Americans. They have connections to the homeland. They know how India works. They can facilitate trade and economic relationships because they can speak the language, both literally and metaphorically. They can make sure that conversations about India in Washington are richer and more multidimensional than maybe they would be if they weren't there. All of that, I think, lends itself to a much healthier, long-term partnership between the countries. And at the end of the day, the relationship that's being built and has been built over the last 20 years will outlive Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi and myself, right? And at the end of the day, I suppose we'd much rather that these countries with large populations, large economies, find good ways to trade with each other, to bring their regulations in line on technology, than to be at odds with each other. It's unfortunate that we end up having to sacrifice democracy and human rights and all of those other values as, sort of just byproducts of the relationship. I would much rather that both countries just be much more matter of fact and say, this is important strategically. We'd love to sell you very expensive weapons. We'd like to buy your expensive weapons, and we don't have to keep couching it in the language of democracy, because that does damage to those concepts in ways that undermine, for the global South, the credibility of our commitments to those values, and there's something really lost when that dies.
So Kedamete, you agree, don't talk too much about democracy. Instead, over the long run, that diaspora will be a force for good for both countries, is what we're hearing effectively.
Well, not necessarily, because the diaspora, like India, is also split. There's a section of the diaspora that thinks of Modi as the Gujarati Elvis. They're just besotted with him. And then there's another section of the diaspora, like myself, and especially among younger Indian Americans, who are appalled at what's going on in India and are actively, they're almost like dissidents. I have friends of mine who are journalists who are not allowed to re-enter the country that they were raised in because the government has revoked their overseas citizen of India status. So the diaspora can be a force for good, but right now there's a huge struggle over narrative and about India globally and in the diaspora. Is India a democracy or not? Is India a nation for all its citizens, or is India ultimately that sad thing, a Hindu nationalist state?
There is as well, though, those who say, look, we're not that interested in politics. what we see is that in the past there was a lot of red tape in India, and we want to see less red tape when we're dealing with U.S.-India ties.
So I'm no supporter of the Congress Party, and when they say red tape, they mean socialism. And Modi has had an interesting sort of nativist Indian socialism. There's a huge amount of support for oligarchs, like there's two in particular, Ambani and Adani. And there's an enormous amount of rent-seeking going on in Indian politics, and state support like the licenses to run favored ports and infrastructure.
Suketu Mehta, we're just going to cross over to the White House now and listen to India's Prime Minister and the U.S. President.
Please be seated. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. The Prime Minister and I have just finished a very productive meeting, and the Prime Minister